Good morning. So I'm excited to be here today. For me, it's been a blessed three evenings here with you as church as well. And so I should maybe, for the ones that weren't here in the evenings, just briefly share. My name is Ruben Dyck, and I come from the northern part of Mexico, also known as the Corredor Comercial there. Pastor at church there, and also work on the side a bit alongside with Daryl under Scope. So I'm not sure if I'm still a young dad or if I'm just a dad now, but we have a 10-year-old daughter and an 8-year-old boy, and been married for 16 years now. And so God has been very good. We've been here before. We have family in Blue Creek. I have a brother-in-law there, and so that makes me kind of hesitant to keep on coming with my daughter, who's now starting to get older, because I've seen girls come here and fall in love with the boys in Belize. And then I see parents up in Mexico missing their daughters. But my brother-in-law just tells me they're not safe. Keep in mind that he was the one who went out there to a youth camp and won over a girl's heart and brought her down here. So, no, but there's lovely people here. I've been very much blessed. And so I always say if our kids find a Christian spouse and they do their part in being a Christian spouse, then God will take care of the rest, regardless of where they live. So about the topic today, we talked about different financial principles over these last evenings, and we closed off yesterday talking about generosity, about the importance of not just looking after our own financial growth, but also that of the people around us, that of the region that we live in and the country that we live in, and so forth. And I told you that we're going to talk a bit more about the question, how much should a Christian give? I don't know if we can throw up. I've prepped a bit of a PowerPoint. And I like to refer to the sermon as my wallet and God. And I read a story of three pastors that got together for a coffee. They're talking church, and one of them raises the issue of how their church deals with the money part. And the first pastor says, well, it's very simple. What I do after a Sunday morning is I draw a line on the ground. I stand right in the middle. I take the offering in a plate and I throw it up. The money that lands on the right side is God's, and I use that for His kingdom work. And the money that lands on the left side is what I take as my personal wage. The next one says, well, I do it a little bit different. So what I do is draw a circle. And I stand in the middle of the circle and I throw up the offering. And the money that lands inside of the circle is what I live off of. And the money that lands outside is what I use for God's kingdom. The third one sipping his coffee and just smiling. And they said, well, how about you? What do you do? He says, why the lines and make it complicated? I take the offering and I throw it up. Whatever God keeps up, that is His. Whatever comes back down, that's what I live off of. So I don't know if that was a smart guy, but no, I think fortunately, many churches, and I'm just assuming that it's similar here too, that they work differently, and that's that we get together as a leadership and we work on an actual budget for the year. We look at the needs that the church is going to face, the different committees and teams that operate under the church, mission, ministries, and so on, and then we plan accordingly, and often maybe have a dialogue with the church about it and encourage members to try to meet that budget throughout the year. But even so, I think it often leaves the question for us as God's children, okay, how much should I give? And I sometimes feel like it's one of those issues that there's almost as many points of view about it as there's people. Read about it in different commentaries and stuff, and so people don't necessarily look at it from the same perspective. I've heard those who say, well, Jesus clearly said that what one of our hands does, the other one doesn't need to know about. And so people that would say, well, I shouldn't even keep track of what I give. Simply give as God puts it on my heart, and then done. There's others that very often still talk about the tithe and have it very clear that a Christian is called to give a tithe of his income. Even there, I think it leads to interesting questions. A tithe of what? So in my case, I get paid monthly, so that's easy. I know what my income is, a tithe, okay. But what about for a business owner or a farmer? Is that the tithe from the total income? Is that the tithe from my net profit at the end of the year? after expenses and taxes, just before reinvesting? What about the year that I'm operating at a loss? Especially thinking about farms and stuff. And so that still leaves a question. Then there's others that say, well, a tithe is a great place to start, but as God blesses us and we keep on growing, why not give more? And there's amazing stories of people that end up giving 90% and living off of 10% towards the later years in their life. And then there's others that would say, well, let's just keep it clear that the tithe was in the Old Testament, and Paul clearly said, give as you can joyfully do from your heart. And they would say, plan for it, look at your income, plan how much you want to give, how much you can give joyfully and not under pressure, and then do it. And so, different points of view. What I would like to do this morning with you is kind of do a general walk through the Bible. Now, I'm very much aware that we're not going to be able to hit every single passage that talks about money in the Bible. We have a lot of them, but I'd kind of like to take the main themes and go through them. If we could go to the next slide, I want to start off exactly with the tithe in the Old Testament. A biblical scholar by the name Paul Levertov says that the habit of giving a tithe, either of the earnings or the war profits, was a common practice among different people even before the time of Moses. That people would simply give a tithe, offer a tithe to the deity that they put their faith in. As far as the biblical record goes, it's in Genesis 14, verses 17 to 20, that we find the first mention of a tithe. I'm not going to read through all of these verses, but I would encourage you, if you brought your Bible, they'll be put on here, and just to open your Bibles and to look at these passages while we talk about them. So in this passage, we have a story about Abraham, and we hear in the previous verses that his family member Lot gets taken captive. And so Abraham takes his men and he goes after the guys who took Lot. There's a war that takes place, and Abraham has a victory, and he brings his Freundschaft, or his relatives, back home safely. And we read in these passages that as he comes back, he runs into a priest of God by the name of Melchizedek, if I'm saying that correctly. And so what Abraham does is, well, first this priest speaks a blessing over him. And then we see him taking a tithe of what he took in this war and giving it to this priest, and through him actually to God. The second example we find in his grandson Jacob. And that's in Genesis 28. And here we basically read about Jacob making a covenant with God, or a promise, where he voluntarily says to God that of all the things that you give me, I will give you a tithe. And so these are kind of cases of people just voluntarily giving up a tithe of what they've been giving, or in Jacob's case, even looking ahead and promising to give a tithe. Later on, and if we could go to the next slide, we have different tithes being mentioned through Moses. Now, I know that in the church we often talk about tithe, but something that I hadn't realized till a couple of years ago is that the Bible actually talks about a few different kinds of tithes. I don't know if you've ever noticed that. It was new to me. And there's actually 3 or technically 4 kinds of tithes. And so the following points that I'm going to share, I want to cite Harvey Platt. It sounded yesterday like Harvey's been here years ago. So a college professor from up in Manitoba, Canada. And he sent me a document and a whole study that he had done on this. And so if we go to Numbers 18, we will see some of these tithes mentioned, or at least 2 of them. So Numbers 18, verse 21. What we see is that the whole people of Israel, well, all the tribes except Levi's, they're asked to come up with a tithe of their income, we could say, or what the land brings them. And that tithe was going to go to the tribe of Levi. Now what we see here is an interesting thing. God set up a social order where there was public servants. And so he allocated land to every single tribe except Levi. But to the tribe of Levi, he gave the special privilege of being the public servants. And there's different things that they would have done, and I think it would not be too different to draw some similarities with the way that Mennonite colonies are often set up, where we have different leaders within the community that look after the order and things as far as the social life goes, the economic life or the Wirtschaft, and that can come forward. And so the Levites too, they were just a few examples. There was a lot of laws about how to deal with certain sicknesses that we read in the Old Testament. And so the Levites were the ones that would often go out, explore the person, look at the sickness or the scars and stuff, and then tell them what to do, the period of cleansing and so forth. They were also the ones that would look after social order and justice, the ones that would foster education and many of these things. And so this first tithe, I sometimes, looking back now, I think it's almost like some of the income tax that we pay today. And we see that the whole concept of a government, the concept of public servants was instituted by God. And it's something that we need. And we see it every time. If there's a good social order, a community can grow and it can blossom. But in order for us to have that, we need public servants. And they need to be taken care of too, so that they can dedicate their life to the service. And so that's where this came in. If we can go one slide further. So there was another one, and we find this one in the verses 25 to 31. Now this was a tithe that was not applied to the entire tribes, but only to the tribe of Levi. So they would have just gotten a tithe. Now God turns around and says to the tribe of Levi, of the tithe that you get, I want you to give a tithe specifically to the descendants of Aaron, who were in the priesthood. So just to make things clear, not every Levite was a priest, but the descendants of Aaron, who were part of the Levi tribe, they were priests. And so they basically took or looked after the whole temple. So we just saw the public servants that looked after the social side of things, more the government side, but the priests, they look after the temple. And so that would not be very, very different from the people that serve in our churches nowadays. That could be the pastor or secretary, cleaning crew, different people that are giving of their time. And I think today we do a lot with people just giving their time too, which is awesome and allows us to do a lot of things in the church as well. But this would tie into that to the people that live off of the church by serving it. And so, like I said, that was a tithe that only the Levites paid. Now, if we look a bit now, we can see these two sides that are in God's heart. He wants to make sure that there can be a social order and that there will be finances set apart that will make that possible, but also that there will be a thriving spiritual life, which came under the temple at that time, and that finances will be put forward to make that possible as well. Now, if we can go to the next one, this was another one that was asked of everyone, and we find that in Numbers 14. Deuteronomy. Yeah, Deuteronomy 14, verses 22 to 26. Now, what we find here is another interesting one, and God basically tells them to put away a tithe of their harvest and their things, so that they will have that and be able to enjoy it in God's presence for the feasts. Now, there were a couple of feasts through the year that God had ordered them, where they would travel from their place of origin to the temple and worship God collectively as a people. And each of these feasts, they were directed in a way that people would look back at what God had done and celebrate it together in the presence of their families and just think about God's faithfulness. If I look at this, it's almost like a budget. God was telling them to set these things aside so that they would be able to afford to participate in these feasts. And he even goes as far as saying, if you live way too far and it's not practical to take your sheep and your grain along, you can convert it into silver, and then when you get to the point of worship, you can buy your things there and then participate and worship God accordingly. I don't know if you have that practice here. Back in our region, back at home, I would say that Thanksgiving is a big feast in the church year. It usually comes at the end of harvest, and if I think of our local church, that's the biggest offering that we get through the year. Many of the farmers, they will give as good as they can through the year, but they're very often, part of their crop is starting to be sold, and that's where they will give a big contribution. And so I sometimes make the comparison between these feasts to our modern day Thanksgiving celebrations, where we have this day where we get together, we just think in a special way of the way that God has blessed. We have a meal together as a church, and we just share of the things that God has given us. And often a good chunk of that goes to mission and different kinds of projects. And if we can go to the last one here on this slide, there was another tithe that we also find in Deuteronomy 14, verse 28 to 29. Now, the interesting thing about this tithe is that it happened every third year, if you read there. And so they were asked to put aside another tithe, and this was thinking especially of the poor, the foreigner, the widow, the orphan. We could say that the people that are often kind of left behind socially. And so if we look at it in God's providence, He has a wonderful plan here where He looks after a social order, a thriving spiritual life, making sure that people will be able to afford to participate in these feasts, and then finally making sure that no one's going to be left behind, that the foreigner is going to be taken care of, the widow, the orphan, and that's going to come along too. And so this, I think, would be very similar to what many churches now might have: a deacons fund, a mission fund, that looks after the vulnerable within the community and seeks to help them as well. And so I think a lot of the ways that we practice finances today might have their background in the system. Now, if we can go one forward, I've added the numbers here. They might be a bit small on the screen. But if we look at it, so we often talk about a tithe, but here's a biblical reality. So for the whole tribes, there was one first 10%, a second 10%, and since the other one was every third year, we're looking at a 3.33%. So there's a question: if we talk about should I tithe, okay, which tithe am I talking about? Because Israel was giving close to 23%. If we can go one further, there's commentators or biblical scholars that talk about that if you now also add the firstborn offering that you brought and the first fruit offerings and other things, it might have been closer to a 30%. Now again, looking at our modern world, I think that there's two things in this 30%, which is income tax, but also the tithe for God's kingdom. So just an interesting thing to look at it. I want to say one more thing. I don't know how relevant it is here. It's very relevant in our community, but I would say this carefully, and I'll say more about it later. But what I don't find in the Bible is a bunch of raffles and auctions and fundraisers to try to keep our institutions going. So more about that later. Now I'd like to just move on to the New Testament, if we could do the next. Yep. So the thing is, there's not very clear verses in the New Testament that just straight out clearly state that we should tithe. In Matthew 23, we find Jesus criticizing the Pharisees for the way that they practice generosity. And so he says, sure, you guys give your tithe on the spices, but he says you fail to do what is even more important, and that's to look after mercy and justice and faithfulness. And so Jesus challenges them and says, you should do the first, but without ignoring the latter, being justice, mercy, faithfulness. And so Jesus encourages them to keep on tithing. He doesn't say that was a bad thing, that it was necessary, but he also says it's not the most important thing. Think about justice, mercy for the people around you. Mark 12:17 is another interesting one, and here they try to trap Jesus, and they ask him, is it right that we pay taxes to Caesar? And Jesus' answer is very simple. He says, give Caesar what is Caesar's, and give to God what is God's. Now, looking through the Old Testament structure that we just covered, and Jesus talking about both Caesar and about God, I kind of asked myself, okay, was Jesus underlining not like the all of the laws that we find in the Old Testament, but God's heart that we find in there? That I pay my taxes so that there can be social order, and I pay my tithe to the church so that God's kingdom can keep on growing. So I give to Caesar, but I also give to God. So the New Testament is full with a lot of passages. If we can go to the next slide, I want to just briefly touch on a few of Paul. And so we have Romans 12:1. That's an interesting verse. And what Paul basically says, if I reflect on what God has done through His grace, through Jesus Christ, the only valid response is that I give my body and we could say my whole life to God as a sacrifice. And we talked about this yesterday in the workshop, that just thinking about it, God gave His only Son. Now, He didn't wait for us to first make our lives perfect and figure everything out. Paul also wrote that while we were sinners, God sent His only Son. And so the best way that we can come back to God is to give our lives. And I would say that means giving everything that we are. We talked about it yesterday. The money that I have, the time that I have, and the gifts that I have. And I use that for God's glory. And so I would dare to say this: God just doesn't want our wallet, He wants all of us. He wants our whole heart, so to speak. Now, the second passage on this list, where Paul writes to the church in Corinth, in his first letter, he basically encourages them and says, if you gather weekly, put away some money. And for the day that I come, that it will be ready. And so we kind of find this initial practice of setting something away on a weekly basis, like we have our offering systems within church. Now, the last passage on this slide, in the second letter to the church in Corinth, that could be a sermon in and of itself, verses 6 to 11 there. But I just want to briefly go through them. And so first off, in verse 6, Paul basically says, those who sow stingily or sparingly, they will also reap very little. But those who share, those who sow like generously, they will also reap generously. And so I think there's an important part here, and that we also see that God blesses those who are faithful givers. Now, I want to be careful with this, and I always say, I don't want people looking at God as a bank or a mutual fund that I'm putting my investment in and now expecting 100% interest rate on what I've given Him. But I want to encourage us to look at it differently, that I don't give for what God is going to give me afterwards, but that I give for what He's given me up to this point. And I think Sunday morning is a beautiful moment, and the offering is an act of worship, where it's not just a habit of taking money and putting it in the plate or whatever we use to gather it, but where I just briefly look back at the last week and say, God's been faithful, thank you, God, and I give back generously of what you have given me, with a trust that He will continue to look after us. And then we have verse 7, which is very famous, and where Paul basically says that each one should give according to what they find in their heart, that we shouldn't give under pressure. And that's a thing. I think we can come to the church and legalistically give a tithe. And it hurts us, and we're feeling grumpy about it, but nayo, that's what we're supposed to do, and so I earned $100, I'm going to put 10 in there. Wish I didn't have to, but I'm going to do it because that's what I have to. I think that's kind of like the offering in the Old Testament, where the smoke kind of went shrut. Like, God isn't necessarily pleased by that. We might be doing it legalistically, and I think if we give a single dollar out of those 100, but that comes from our heart and it comes joyfully, that's more meaningful to God than a forceful giving. And I think the other concept that comes out here is kind of what we talked about over these evenings, that we budget for our giving, and that we look at, okay, what is my position right now? What am I able to give? And that we give accordingly out of gratitude and out of joy, not out of pressure. Verse 11 is really interesting too, and Paul basically says that very often our giving is going to bring out gratitude in other people towards God. And Ramsey shares an interesting story about this, where he goes to the grocery store and he's in the back of the line just watching what is happening. And he says at the front of the line is a young mother with her little toddler and a shopping cart with different groceries. And so she puts them on there and the cashier starts putting them through. And then she looks at her wallet and starts counting cash, and it's very obvious what is happening. She does not have enough money to cover the basic groceries that she was going to buy. And so she starts pulling certain items back, filtering through it. And I don't know if you've been through that. I have vivid memories as a kid doing that at the store. And so that meant that the yummy Lucky Charms had to go back and maybe put a cornflakes on the top, but whatever. He says there's another guy just behind her in the till. Very obviously a Mexican immigrant worker that doesn't know the language yet. But he says you don't need to understand English to see what is happening in that situation. And so what this guy does, he says, is a construction worker in his dirty clothes, but he looks at her and says, no. And he starts pushing the groceries back to the other side of the cashier. And he takes out Ramsey would point out his debit card and says to the cashier, "Aquí." And Ramsey says, you know what happened is that this young mother's eyes just filled with tears, and she looks at this worker and thanks him, but he says after that she looks up and says thank you. And that's what very often happens. People might have come upon tough times and they're crying out to God and wondering how to make ends meet. And if there's a faithful giver helping them, yes, they will thank the person, but their attention will also go up towards God. And it'll just be this vivid voice saying, I'm still here. I haven't left you alone. I'm still with you. And so there's a lot in this giving. So this might still leave us with the question, okay, so we've kind of done a very quick walk through the Bible, but what does that mean? How much should I give? I would say this, that nowadays we don't have temples, but we have a whole church system. And thinking about you guys here too, I think it's very similar to what we have back in our hometown. And one is simply, we have a church building where we gather. And that needs maintenance. There goes money into keeping a building up and running so that we can gather. I think you have a school next to the church here, and that's the same thing. There's a whole infrastructure that needs to be taken care of, and we need money so that we can operate that. We do different things as a church throughout the year to foster a spiritual life, to foster fellowship, and very often some of those events cost us money too, just to facilitate it. It might be a simple thing as offering a meal there. And so those are things where the church needs money too. And then there's the other part, which is staff. I think many churches nowadays have at least one or a couple of people on their staff that they're giving a wage so that the church can function. Then there's the other things that we talked about, our mission funds, our deacons funds that are used to help people. Now, obviously, the more that we have in these funds, the more we can do to help different people and to continue building God's kingdom. And so I would say all of this is similar to the temple within the Old Testament. Now, I don't want to say this as a legalistic rule for our current times, but I want to raise the question today. What would happen if each of us started by tithing, giving the first tithe to our local church? The church that we're a member of, that we're a part of, actively participating in. What would that look like? Now, I don't mean to say that we cannot support other projects outside of church, but let's be honest. Many of us very well have the capacity to put a tithe into the local church and on top be supporting other projects, other individuals too. And so I just want to raise the question, what might that look like? what would happen if each one started faithfully tithing to the local church. Now again, like I said earlier, and I do realize that for a farmer, for a business owner, that there will be years where we might not even turn a profit, where we'll run at a loss. And I don't think that God is legalistically pounding on us there and saying, well, I'm sorry, but I still want the tithe of your net income. I think that God can understand, but there's also going to be other years where we will do better, and the question is, okay, what am I going to do in those years? I've got a couple of friends that started a business together in their early 20s, and they made a deal. And what they do is they run their numbers as a business. So we could say income minus the expenses minus taxes, and of that profit they will donate a tithe as a business. Now they come from two different churches, so they're kind of particular that tithe goes to more neutral places, that they don't feel like they're pulling more towards one or the other. And then they both have their wage, and off of their personal wage, they will then give a tithe to their own local church. Now again, there's been years, just during COVID too, where they came on very tough times, and where they couldn't really give. But then later, they've been very, very generous too, and so those are fun ways to do it. Going back to the auctions, raffles and stuff, like I said, I don't know if that's a thing here, but in our community, we have gotten to a point, and it sometimes saddens me, and it's that churches, mission organizations, Bible schools, private schools, they have a hard time operating because of the finances. And so then we're getting creative, and we're buying a little car and then raffling it off, and we're encouraging people to bring their things and having a church auction, and trying to find these different ways to raise funds and to bring things forward. Now, I don't think that these things are necessarily wrong. And personally, I have to be honest, I love going to church auctions. They're fun environments to hang out and be together and gather money. But what I sometimes see is at the root of this, there's a principle that I tend to give easier if I get something out of it. So if I buy a raffle ticket, there's a chance that I'll win a little car. If I go to the auction and I support, well, I get something back. And so it's easier to give if I get something out of it. And if I look at the Bible, what I see is that I simply give from a generous heart because of what God has given me. And I often think that if we were all faithful in this, these kinds of creative things wouldn't even be necessary. We could do them for the fun and the fellowship, but they would become secondary. And so maybe that's not as much a case here. But for us, I sometimes feel like we're kind of going on a different way. And so again, personally, I don't take a legalistic, but it seems to me, looking at the bigger picture, that it's just a great point of reference that I start with a tithe. And I said yesterday, it doesn't matter how little we have, there will always be someone less fortunate yet. And each one of us can be generous and start giving. And so I think that can be a good reference to begin tithing, and as God gives us the possibility to also increase it in our life, and to not just justify and say, well, I've given my tithe and I'm done. Like, if I can give more, why not? Like I said yesterday, it's a whole lot of fun. And so I want to close with a thought and a brief illustration. And for those that were here yesterday, it's going to be repetition, but Ramsey says that generosity is not just a thing that I do, but it's a character trait. It's who I am. And we talked about it yesterday, that we can be generous with the money that we've been given, we can be generous with the time that we have, and with the gifts that God has given us. The spiritual gifts, things that we can serve with. And here's the thing. A generous person will seldomly be sad. There's an incredible thing, and I found that in my life, where I have seasons where I live more selfish, and I start getting sad and, moutless, as we would say. And when I start focusing more on the others and on serving, I feel joy coming back in my life. It's interesting how that works. Now, I want to close with an illustration here. I took some plastic things that I had handy, But it comes from a book by a Jewish rabbi, Daniel Lapin. And he talks a bit about the Jewish practice of Sabbath. And again, I don't want to endorse that we now have to go back to Jewish rules and practice the Sabbath in the way that they do. But there's something that I found beautiful. And he says that they will start it off with their Sabbath dinner, which is a very special time to be together as a family around the table. And to look back with gratitude at the work that took place within the last week. But to also disconnect from the work, to rest, and to put their focus on God. I mean, it should be a daily thing, right? But there's this special moment there as well. And he says that for part of the supper, there's this liturgy or whatever we would call it, where they start singing a song about God's faithfulness. And so they will have kind of a shateltje, I would say, or a little bowl, and in it, this glass. And then take a bottle of wine, and I brought Coke today. And so what they'll do is, while they're singing this song, focusing on God's generosity, on His faithfulness, they will gradually pour the cup full with the wine. But here's the thing, they won't stop when it gets full. They will let it overflow and then keep pouring. And the thing that he writes about it is, it's a visual reminder to these kids, these youth, as they grow up, that first there's the cup. So we look after our own household, and we make sure that our spouse and our kids have what they need. But we live in a way that allows it to also overflow. That we don't just look after our own household, but we live in a way that allows it to overflow to the people around us. And I thought that's just a beautiful example. It's like, just imagine kids seeing that on a weekly basis and being raised with that. I don't know if they all do it, but this rabbi wrote about it. And I think it's something that maybe not literally the supper thing, but it's a mentality, it's a practice, it's an attitude that we can instill in our kids, and that we can live in our household, that we look after the needs, but that we also always, I would go back to the budget, that we plan our life in such a way that there can be money flowing over, that we can share with the others. And I think that the same would apply to our churches too. As we plan for a church budget, that we plan it in a way too, and look at, okay, what are the local programs, what are the local needs of the church? But then how can we plan it so that even the offerings that we collect as a church flow over just the local needs as well, and benefit the people around us that are outside of the church as well. And so I just want to encourage us to give back to God with a generous heart. Not as an investment, although I know that God is going to bless, and it might not always be financial. He can bless in countless ways in our life. But I want to simply encourage us to give out of generosity, out of thankfulness and joy for what God has done in us. May that be the last week, the last month, the last year, through our life. Let us bow for a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you again for your generosity towards us, the unconditional love that you have, and that you sent your Son while we were sinners, that you didn't wait for us to figure things out to make them perfect first, but that you met us in our sinful state and cared for us and opened the door so that we could come back to you. And today I thank you for your wisdom that we find in your word, for ways that a community can grow and move forward socially, economically, but also the church, that your kingdom can flourish in the region that you've put us, and even further and further out. And I just pray today that you would fill our hearts with gratitude, with joy, and that we could continue to give back from what you've given us, and to share joyfully, and that you would bless those gifts and let them keep on giving. We pray that in Jesus' name with thankfulness. Amen.